I would encourage people, if they want to essentially know what's planned in that scenario, to go and read the book written by Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO I mentioned earlier, and Henry Kissinger, called The Age of AI, Our Human Future. So essentially there they frame a lot of stuff as warnings, but if you have any idea into who Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger are and what they've done in their careers, they don't really seem like they're very concerned about some of the impacts they claim to be concerned about to me, but that's just me personally. But there are some things they say in there that objectively do consider careful consideration. So one of those is that, AI, they say, invariably lead to a division of society. Essentially, they don't use this term, but I will use it, into classes of haves and have-nots. But the way they define it is a little different. So what happens if there's a big crisis, your country is like a war zone, or the economy collapses, and you're dependent on humanitarian aid or some sort of aid from the government or some other group, and there isn't enough for everyone. And so they decide, oh, well, it's fair to put super intelligent AI in charge of it. And then that AI is like, oh, well, this person's been very compliant and hasn't committed all of these thought crimes, but not you. Who is it going to decide to give the food rations to and stuff like that? That's the risk of a lot of this stuff when it gets put in charge of too many systems. They've gone from before this AI algorithm to identifying something like 15 to 20 targets a day to identifying hundreds of targets a day. Something's going on. And there's a huge issue there with what if that AI is using, social media activity to decide who lives and who dies, literally. And what happens when that that kind of technology gets exported. Israel's tech sector specifically is known for testing all sorts of tech on Palestinians, surveillance tech and weapons tech, and then they export it abroad. Israel's, defense tech and defense industry is massive. It's like, I think, one of the biggest parts of their GDP. So this isn't just going to stay there. And AI weaponry has also been tested in Ukraine to a significant degree, and there's a lot of people, the same people that created Palantir, essentially Peter Thiel, a lot of that money is behind, the AI weaponry stuff today. That's troubling stuff. And then there's another issue of whether AI is actually accurate or not. So, they'll say, like with facial recognition, I think there was a report a few years ago in the UK that a lot of the facial recognition stuff that the Met Police and other law enforcement groups are using are insanely inaccurate, but they want to continue using it and deepen its involvement in identifying people, whether it's at live events and all sorts of stuff. And it was insanely inaccurate. I can't remember the exact amount, but it was under 50% accurate. So flipping a coin is more accurate in that case. And what happens when AI algorithms that choose who lives and who dies, are put in charge of stuff and they're 70% accurate or less? Because the government's really corrupt with contractors. They don't always pick the best contractor for the job. So someone has connections that gets their AI in charge and they oversell the AI and say it's 95% accurate, but it's not audited by an independent company. And so it's actually in reality 65% accurate or something. And you're putting it in charge of stuff that has a major effect on people's lives. That kind of stuff is happening. I'm talking about stuff that hasn't necessarily quite happened yet, but we're headed there. So people need to keep in mind that a large amount of alternative media gets money from what I refer to as Thielverse, meaning Peter Thiel, right? But really more broadly, it's the PayPal mafia, as it's been called, people affiliated with PayPal to various degrees, which of course includes Elon Musk. They have a lot of influence over alternative media and even over content platforms like Rumble, and have been funding quote unquote libertarian movements and all of the stuff, but I don't really see them as being libertarian at all. So taking Peter Thiel as an example, Peter Thiel claims to be a Bitcoin maximalist, right? And then he goes, after he says that, on a panel next to then CIA Director Mike Pompeo and says, Bitcoin is a Chinese financial weapon against the US dollar. And then in terms of libertarianism, Peter Thiel says he's a libertarian, but instead he created Palantir, which is the most insane surveillance tool that the CIA has today. So you literally handed the worst part of the state the worst tool possible, but you're a libertarian, you're against state overreach. And so similarly, Elon Musk you have to look at the actions of Musk and then what he says. And not enough people do that, whether it's for Musk or really anyone. You have to look at people's actions, not just what they say, because someone can say all the right things and then, be totally you behind your back. And if you're just going to take what they're telling you and the excuses and whatever, you'll never figure out what's actually going on. And I think that's fair for Elon Musk as well. Did he buy Twitter to say free speech, or did he buy Twitter to have a massive data to train AI on? and to train all other sorts of products he has on? Or did he make it, like he's openly admitted, did he buy it so he can turn Twitter, now X, into X the everything app that isn't just social media, it becomes half of the financial system and becomes American WeChat, which of course WeChat in China is the everything app, means you have all the data, basically. If people use it for it accumulates more data than everything else, and it has all the control. So people are naive here, I think, because, I mean, Elon Musk is the richest man in the world, but is he the richest man in the world just because of his own entrepreneurial whatever? Or is it because his companies were held up by government subsidies that allowed him to become rich, and he's the richest man in the world because he worked with the state? His company, SpaceX, is currently a contractor to both the military and intelligence communities. Its success is contingent on those contracts, SpaceX. And his entire trajectory up to this point has been contingent on government subsidies or things of that nature. That's a problem. So, I mean, this is stuff that people need to keep in mind. And ultimately, I think there's a lot of cultural issues with celebrity in the West, where people have been trained to wait for a political savior who's going to come and save us of all of our problems, and no one actually has to do anything. And we can just sit back and wait for the right person to run for office, and then we all vote for them, and then this one person is magically gonna save us from all of our problems. People have sort of been primed to feel that way. I mean, you can argue maybe like superhero movies and religion maybe and all other sorts of stuff has shaped us to be like that culturally, but that is a problem. What we should do is take responsibility for what we need to survive and what our communities need to survive, and get as local as possible and not be so dependent on these people at the national level or assume that one person can fix everything, because that hasn't worked. And I mean, things are more complicated now than they've been in a very long time. And can we really wait for the right person and put all our trust in this theoretical one person who's going to save everything? I don't think so. I think that time is better spent, learning how to do some stuff yourself, taking responsibility for your own life and your well-being and your family's well-being. I mean, a lot of people in alternative media are going to promote certain figures. I mean, maybe they're funded by them, maybe they're not. But ultimately, a lot of what keeps the current system in power is our trust in it. Like the financial system in particular. Trust is super fundamental to that, but it doesn't deserve our trust, the current system. And so we need to withdraw our consent from the system and our trust in these people who have spent decades and decades and decades screwing everyone over. It's time to put our trust in people who actually deserve it. And a lot of times in any one person's life, the people you actually know you can trust are people at the local level. And so I think, it's time to kind of start there. That sort of leads into the whole idea of like decentralization also. The more power goes back to the local level, the less power the national or state or whatever has. And there needs to be a power shift towards the public and towards the people. And we can't just wait for the right politician to be put in charge of the state to give that to us, right? We have to do that ourselves, because as we've historically seen, the state, whether it's capitalist or communist, accumulates more money and power for itself. So sort of this more elite tier would be the people that determine AI's objective function, that program and develop AI and understand what AI does to people. And then the lower class presumably would be much larger, and that is the class that AI will act upon, but people will lose the ability to know what AI is doing to them. And they argue that this process of people losing the ability to know what AI is doing to them will happen because of this phenomena they refer to as cognitive diminishment, which is sort of this idea that's pretty easy to verify. If you stop doing mental math and use a calculator all the time, it gets harder and harder and harder to do mental math. And the same is true for really like any skill that you don't practice. So they argue that because of the convenience of AI and how it's been creeping into our lives, and I think we've seen this a lot since the advent of generative AI, it will become harder and harder and harder and eventually impossible for people to do certain things, including make decisions for themselves, because the AI will tell you where to go, it will tell you what music to listen to, it will tell you what clothes to buy. And essentially, that's their vision. People will eventually lose the ability to make those decisions for themselves or even develop their own preferences without the assistance of artificial intelligence. And so obviously the way to fight against that is to not outsource all of your decision-making and skills to that. And unfortunately, I think as we've seen with the rise of generative AI, people are creating less. People are outsourcing their creativity to AI, have AI make art for me, have AI write things for me. And eventually that leads to a world where in a generation, people don't know how to create art or create music or write without AI. And what does that ultimately mean for humanity? Then essentially we do end up in sort of this helpless state where we become dependent on machines to function. But it only happens if we voluntarily give ourselves over to that type of system and decline to use the abilities granted to us by our consciousness and our souls, and decide to let machines do it for us and have them become the creators and have us just be processors for AI, batteries like the Matrix. I mean, I don't know, but I'd rather not see that come to fruition. And I think the way to avoid that is very easily within the hands of anybody, regardless of your economic status or what your skills are. Everybody can create something. Maybe you whittle things out of wood. Maybe you make music. Maybe you make art, visual art, or other, woven art. I don't know. There's all sorts of things people do. People have always been creating ever since we've existed as a species. And I think if we surrender that, then the post-human future would be an inevitability. And that's essentially what these people are hoping for. And I think it's important for people to fight against that. And I think when people talk about resisting this agenda, this is something that inherently gets left out of that discussion. And I don't think it should be at all. Because again, I don't think people are really reading what a lot of these architects of AI policy are thinking and saying. People are just willingly using it because it's convenient, it's easy, but without really thinking about long-term consequences. And I'm sure people that have been using generative AI, in independent media to generate content for your site, has it gotten harder to write those things after using it for a year? Probably. For those people, I would wager. And that type of phenomena is only going to get worse. And what happens when we can't even think for ourselves anymore? Because stopping creating, not being able to write, eventually you're not going to be able to think without the help of this algorithm or whatever. And again, as I mentioned earlier, AI is prone to hallucinating, seeing realities that aren't there, and all sorts of things. And how deep could we get dragged into some sort of artificial illusion if we sort of outsource our thinking and our creativity to this type of entity? It's kind of funny because Schmidt and Kissinger argue that these hallucinated realities, AI seeing realities that humans can't observe, mean that the reality must be real because AI is so much more intelligent than us, so that we should believe whatever it sees that's unobservable. And I don't know, maybe that could be true in some instances, but since there's no way to verify, do we really want to shape society around what could be hallucinations of some, human created machine just because, certain people that are powerful in society have an almost religious-like devotion to artificial intelligence? I don't think that makes any sense, personally. When you engage in a creative act, what are you filling up or fulfilling, or what muscle, as you put it, are you using? I would argue it's your soul, right? If you just have AI make it, the person that's making it doesn't get the same type of feeling they get if they actually engaged in the act of making art themselves or with another human. So if we let our souls atrophy because we're not doing anything that, have been fulfilling to human souls for thousands of years, what does that ultimately mean? It's interesting, in that same Schmidt-Kissinger book, they basically say that AI taking over will lead to one of two consequences. One of them is that the peasants rise up and overthrow the elite. That's one scenario, and probably not the scenario that Schmidt and Kissinger want. And then the second scenario is that AI spawns the creation of a new religion. So out of those two allegedly inevitable scenarios per those people, obviously I think it's quite clear, if you're familiar with the backgrounds of Schmidt and Kissinger, the outcome they want is that it creates a new religion. So we atrophy our souls and creativity in that spark that makes us human and outsource it to AI, and then it becomes a new religion. I mean, it's pretty crazy. It makes me think of the Greek myth of Narcissus, where he falls in love with his reflection. I think it's that would definitely be a way that gets us to that post-human future, and it's something I think people should resist, because there's something important about humanity. There's obviously a reason that there's sort of this push to sort of snuff that out, and I think ultimately it leads to a world where humans are just easily controlled and essentially either harvested for data, harvested for energy, harvested for something, and not creators anymore. And it's up to anybody if they choose what path they choose to go down, whether they're going to go down the path of someone who creates and can manifest and who can, actively do things and actively make decisions and have preferences and do these things that ultimately are part of what defines humans, or if they're going to go down the path of, I'm going to be lazy essentially and let these machines do everything for me. But then you become either not necessarily even part of the machine. Instead of the machine serving you, you end up serving the machine. And I think that's how we get to digital slavery quite fast if too many people take that path. So I think there's a lot of things people can do to, resist these agendas, but I think that is a very easy and important, very important thing for people to do and consider. If you want to use AI occasionally because you're in a pinch to generate something, that's not going to screw you over long term necessarily. But if you become reliant on it and that's all you use, and then after a year or something, yeah, you probably will see a difference. And, their vision, the Kissinger-Schmidt vision, is that this will happen on a society level and that people will become, as they say, cognitively diminished. That does not sound positive. That does not sound good. So if you choose to use AI, I would urge you to make sure that you're not cognitively diminishing yourself. I think the whole idea of getting a lot of people to use ChatGPT and all of this stuff is to lead us down this path that Kissinger and Schmidt, among others, sort of were charting out for humanity. It's pretty much common sense, though. If you develop a skill and then don't do it for 10 or 15 years, for example, you kind of forget how to do it, right? Or even, I graduated from university a little more than 10 years ago. How well do I recall the stuff that I took in university? Not great, right? So there's this whole idea of if you don't use it, you lose it. So if people are depending on AI to tell them where to turn when they're driving their car and, no one uses actual maps anymore. I understand that it's convenient, right? And I'm not saying we need to go back to the 90s, but it becomes after a while a slippery slope where people are just having the computer tell them everything to do. Every step of their lives ends up becoming micromanaged to an extent. And the idea is that AI, through all the data that it absorbs about us, knows so much about us. Some of these people say it knows us better than we even know ourselves. That allows for an unprecedented degree of manipulation. And the problem is that the people producing and programming AI and ultimately controlling AI and what it can do not have our best interests at heart. And it is not a good idea to basically hand them our brains in a bag. Who owns AI, right? It's pretty much Silicon Valley companies. So even OpenAI, Sam Altman's thing, that's essentially owned by Microsoft. And so you have Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Oracle, all of these companies essentially owning almost everything. And all of those companies are contractors for the military and intelligence. Yes, throw a Palantir in the mix too. And when you consider something like Palantir, they profile people. They suck up all of your data and then they profile you. And Palantir can profile whether or not they deem you subversive or not. And what happens when AI gets access of that and gets put in control of things like humanitarian aid, like they're talking about doing, or in charge of, the government itself, which is also talked about in the Schmidt-Kissinger book. It gets complicated. So, a lot of people have been talking about the coming sort of social credit paradigm, for example.